Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of the military training ground, watching seasoned soldiers struggle through what seemed impossible. For 10 years, no one had conquered the elite combat course that separated the ordinary from the extraordinary. The record holder's name was etched in bronze, untouchable, legendary. "Can I try?" she asked quietly. The laughter that followed would haunt those men for years to come. Not because it was cruel, but because they had no idea they were looking at history in the making. Sometimes, the most dangerous words in any language are spoken by someone others have already decided to underestimate. This is the story of how 3 simple words shattered a decade-old record and changed everything anyone thought they knew about limits, determination, and what it really means to prove yourself when the whole world is watching you fail. Sarah Martinez had always been different, though she spent most of her life trying to hide it. Growing up in a small Texas town where football was religion and gender roles were carved in stone, she learned early that being a girl who could outrun the quarterback wasn't something to celebrate. It was something to apologize for. Her father, Miguel Martinez, worked double shifts at the local factory, his hands permanently stained with motor oil, and his dreams long since buried under the weight of responsibility. Her mother, Elena, cleaned houses for families who lived in neighborhoods they could only drive through, never daring to dream of calling home. They were good people, hard-working people, but they carried the kind of quiet resignation that comes from generations of being told to be grateful for scraps. Sarah was their middle child, sandwiched between Roberto, who had inherited their father's broad shoulders and gentle acceptance of limitation, and Maria, who possessed their mother's talent for making herself invisible when men were talking. But Sarah had inherited something different entirely, something that made her parents worry and her teachers uncomfortable. She had inherited fire. It started small. In elementary school, when the boys said girls couldn't play soccer, Sarah didn't argue. She simply showed up to every pickup game until they had no choice but to let her play. When she consistently outscored them, they changed the rules. When she adapted to the new rules, they changed the field. When she mastered the new field, they stopped inviting her. But Sarah had learned something valuable in those dusty afternoons that would serve her for the rest of her life. Persistence was a weapon they couldn't take away from her. High school brought new challenges. Sarah's body had developed the kind of natural athleticism that couldn't be hidden. No matter how much she slouched or how baggy the clothes she wore. She was 5'6" of pure muscle, with reflexes that made her PE teachers stop and stare. But in a town where the biggest excitement was Friday night football games, there wasn't much use for a girl who could climb ropes faster than the star linebacker. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, was a well-meaning woman who had been dispensing the same advice for 30 years. She sat across from Sarah in her cramped office, surrounded by college brochures that might as well have been travel guides to Mars for all the relevance they had to most of her students. "You have good grades, Sarah," Mrs. Patterson said, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the file. "Have you thought about nursing? Or maybe teaching? Both are very respectable careers for young women." Sarah stared at the woman across the desk, feeling the familiar weight of other people's expectations settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. "What about the military?" she asked quietly. Mrs. Dole, Patterson's smile faltered for just a moment before reassembling itself into something that was meant to be encouraging, but came across as patronizing. "Well, dear, the military can be very demanding. And there are certain physical requirements that might be challenging for someone of your build." It was the polite way of saying what everyone in town thought but rarely voiced, that Sarah Martinez, despite her obvious athletic ability, was still just a girl from a poor family who should probably lower her expectations before life did it for her. That night, Sarah sat on the front steps of her family's small house, watching the sunset over a landscape that had never seemed smaller. Roberto was inside, helping their father repair an old radio that would probably break again within a month. Maria was in the kitchen with their mother, learning to make tortillas with the patient precision of someone who understood that this might be the most valuable skill she would ever acquire. But Sarah couldn't make herself go inside. Something was shifting in her chest, a restlessness that felt like it might tear her apart if she didn't find a way to channel it. She had spent 17 years learning to fit into spaces that were too small for her, and she was running out of room to shrink. The military recruiter came to their high school on a Tuesday in October. Sergeant Williams was everything Sarah had expected. Tall, imposing, with the kind of presence that made teenagers either stand straighter or look for the nearest exit. He set up his table in the cafeteria during lunch, his polished boots reflecting the fluorescent lights as he waited for potential recruits to approach. Most of the students gave him a wide berth. The football players strutted past with the kind of swagger that came from knowing they already had their futures mapped out, at least until graduation. The college-bound kids hurried past with their arms full of textbooks and their heads full of plans that didn't include military service. But Sarah found herself drawn to the table like a moth to flame. "Interested in serving your country?" Sergeant Williams asked when she finally worked up the courage to approach. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Up close, she could see that the sergeant was younger than she had initially thought, probably in his late 20s, with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he was capable of. "What branch?" he continued, his tone professional but not unkind. "Army," Sarah said, surprised by how certain she sounded. "Combat roles." This time, Sergeant Williams did look surprised. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her small frame and young face. "Combat roles are extremely demanding," he said carefully. "The physical requirements alone." "What are they?" Sarah interrupted. "The requirements." Sergeant Williams pulled out a folder and began listing the standards. Push-ups, sit-ups, 2-mile run times, obstacle courses, combat training protocols. With each requirement he mentioned, Sarah felt the fire in her chest burn brighter. These weren't impossible numbers. They were just numbers no one had ever expected her to meet. "I can do those," she said when he finished. "Have you ever tried?" "No," Sarah admitted, "but I can do them." Sergeant Williams leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of attention usually reserved for puzzles or problems that needed solving. "What makes you so sure?" Sarah thought about that question for a long moment. How could she explain that she had spent her entire life being underestimated? How could she make him understand that every time someone told her she couldn't do something, it felt like they were challenging her to prove them wrong? How could she put into words the feeling that she had been training for this conversation her entire life without even knowing it? "Because no one thinks I can," she said finally. It wasn't the answer Sergeant Williams had been expecting, but something in her voice must have convinced him to take her seriously. He handed her a packet of information and his business card. "Think it over," he said. "Talk to your parents. This isn't a decision you make lightly." But Sarah already knew she wouldn't need to think it over. She had found her answer in a conversation she didn't even know she had been looking for. The reaction at home was exactly what she had expected. Her mother cried. Her father sat in stunned silence. Roberto tried to talk her out of it with all the protective instincts of an older brother who had spent his life watching his sister fight battles she shouldn't have had to fight. Maria just stared at her with the kind of awe usually reserved for people who had just announced they were planning to walk on the moon. "Mija," her father said finally, his voice heavy with worry. "The military is not a place for people like me?" Sarah finished. Miguel Martinez looked at his daughter and saw something that both filled him with pride and broke his heart. She had his stubbornness and her mother's courage, but she also had something neither of them possessed: the absolute certainty that she belonged anywhere she decided to put herself. "For people we can't protect," he said quietly. But Sarah had spent 17 years being protected from opportunities because other people thought she needed protection from failure. She was tired of being safe. She was ready to be extraordinary. The decision was made that night, though it would be months before she could act on it. Sarah Martinez was going to join the army, and she was going to do it in a way that would make everyone who had ever doubted her remember her name for the rest of their lives. She just didn't know yet how right she was about that last part. The remaining months of high school passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Sarah threw herself into physical training with the kind of intensity that worried her family and impressed her few friends. She ran every morning before school, did push-ups during lunch, and spent her evenings researching military protocols and combat techniques. By the time graduation arrived, she had transformed herself from a naturally athletic teenager into something that looked suspiciously like a soldier. Her classmates barely recognized the quiet girl who had once tried to make herself invisible. Now she walked with purpose, spoke with confidence, and carried herself like someone who knew exactly where she was going. At the graduation party that the parents had organized, Sarah stood apart from her classmates, watching them celebrate the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Most of them would go to local colleges or stay in town to work at the factory or marry their high school sweethearts. A few would leave for bigger cities and bigger dreams, but none of them would do what Sarah was planning to do. "You're really going through with it," Roberto said, joining her at the edge of the crowd. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "You know it's going to be harder than anything you've ever done. I'm counting on it." Roberto studied his sister's profile in the dim light from the party. She looked the same as always, but something fundamental had changed. The girl who had once apologized for being fast enough to beat the boys in races had been replaced by someone who looked like she was ready to beat the boys at everything. "Just promise me something," he said. "What?" "Promise me you'll come home the same person you are now." Sarah turned to look at her brother, seeing the worry in his eyes and understanding it completely. He was afraid the military would change her, would take the fire that made her special and turn it into something harder and colder. But he didn't understand that the fire had been burning inside her all along, waiting for someone to give her permission to let it out. "I promise I'll come home as myself," she said. "But I can't promise I'll be the same person. I don't want to be the same person." 3 weeks later, Sarah Martinez boarded a bus that would take her to basic training. As the familiar landscape of her hometown disappeared through the window, she felt something she had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. She had no way of knowing that in less than 2 years her name would be spoken with the kind of respect usually reserved for legends. She couldn't have imagined that the same people who had once laughed at her dreams would someday struggle to remember what it felt like before she proved them all wrong. All she knew was that she was finally free to find out who Sarah Martinez really was when no one was telling her who she should be. And that freedom felt like the most dangerous thing in the world. The bus pulled into Fort Benning at 0400 hours on a sweltering Georgia morning that felt like stepping into someone's mouth. Sarah had never experienced humidity like this, thick enough to cut with a knife and suffocating enough to make her question whether she could actually breathe through it. But before she could fully process the climate shock, the doors of the bus opened and her new reality came screaming in. "Get off my bus! Move! Move! Move!" Drill Sergeant Thompson was a force of nature disguised as a human being. 6'4" intimidation with a voice that could strip paint and eyes that seemed to see through whatever facade recruits thought they could hide behind. Sarah had expected this, had prepared for this, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of being one of 43 terrified teenagers suddenly thrust into a world where everything they thought they knew about themselves was about to be systematically dismantled. The first week was designed to break them. Sarah understood this intellectually, but experiencing it was something entirely different. They were given 2 minutes to shower, 30 seconds to eat meals that tasted like cardboard mixed with disappointment, and approximately 4 hours of sleep that came in fragments between night watches and surprise inspections. But the physical challenges were nothing compared to the psychological warfare that masqueraded as team building. Drill Sergeant Thompson had a gift for finding exactly what each recruit was most insecure about and pressing on it like a bruise that would never heal. For Martinez, it was her size and gender, though he was far too clever to make it obvious. "Martinez," he would bark during morning PT, "you're holding up the formation. Pick up the pace." Sarah would be running at the front of the pack, setting a pace that left half the male recruits gasping, but somehow she was always the one holding everyone back. When she did push-ups, her form was critiqued with microscopic precision. When she climbed ropes, the time was never fast enough. When she completed obstacle courses that left grown men lying in the dirt, Thompson would find some technical flaw that required her to start over. The other recruits began to notice. At first, there was sympathy. Martinez was clearly one of the strongest performers in their unit, and Thompson's treatment of her seemed unfair to the point of cruelty. But sympathy in basic training was a luxury no one could afford for very long. Soon, her struggles became everyone's struggles, and resentment began to replace compassion. "Why can't you just quit?" Private Jackson whispered to her one night after Thompson had made the entire unit do extra push-ups because Sarah had allegedly failed to properly secure her footlocker. "You're making this harder for everyone." Jackson was a farm kid from Iowa, built like a linebacker, and raised on the kind of casual misogyny that came disguised as common sense. He wasn't malicious exactly, just convinced that certain people belonged in certain places, and Sarah Martinez was definitely in the wrong place. "I'm not quitting," Sarah whispered back, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that had settled into her bones like concrete. "But why?" This came from Rodriguez, a slight kid from California who had joined the army to escape gang recruitment and was beginning to think you might have made a terrible mistake. "What are you trying to prove?" It was a fair question, and one that Sarah had been asking herself every night as she lay on her narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of 42 other people trying to survive the same crucible she was enduring. What was she trying to prove? That she belonged here? That she was as good as any man? That Drill Sergeant Thompson was wrong about her? But the truth was simpler and more complex than any of those answers. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone else. She was trying to find out what Sarah Martinez was capable of when pushed beyond every limit she had ever imagined. And the only way to find that out was to keep going when every rational part of her brain was screaming at her to stop. Week 3 brought the first major test, the combat fitness evaluation. It was a grueling series of exercises designed to simulate battlefield conditions, combining physical endurance with mental focus under extreme stress. The recruits would have to complete a 2-mile run in full gear, navigate an obstacle course while carrying wounded soldiers, and demonstrate proficiency with weapons while exhausted and disoriented. Sarah had been preparing for this since the day she arrived. While her fellow recruits used their rare free time to write letters home or play cards, she had been studying the course layout, timing herself on individual components, and mentally rehearsing every movement until she could perform them in her sleep. The night before the evaluation, Thompson called her aside for what he termed a reality check. "Martinez," he said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. "I want you to understand something. This evaluation isn't just about physical capability. It's about whether you have what it takes to keep your fellow soldiers alive in combat. Lives depend on every member of a unit being able to perform under pressure." Sarah nodded, unsure where this was going. "I've been hard on you because I need to know you won't fold when things get difficult. But tomorrow, you need to understand that failure isn't just personal. When soldiers can't keep up, other soldiers die. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes, Drill Sergeant, do you? Because if you can't hack it tomorrow, I'm recommending you for discharge. Not because I don't like you, but because I won't send someone into combat who isn't ready." "And Martinez?" He paused, fixing her with a stare that felt like it could see all the way through to her spine. "Based on what I've observed, you're not ready." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. 3 weeks of punishment and persecution, and now Thompson was telling her that it had all been building to this moment. Tomorrow would determine whether she stayed or went home to face everyone who had told her this was impossible. That night, she couldn't sleep. While her bunkmates snored and shifted in their narrow beds, Sarah lay awake staring at the ceiling and running through every possible scenario. She thought about her parents, who were probably lying awake in their own bed, wondering if their daughter was safe and whether they had made a mistake letting her leave. She thought about Roberto and Maria, who were carrying the weight of being the children who had stayed home and played it safe. She thought about Mrs. Patterson and her guidance about respectable careers for young women. But mostly, she thought about the moment when Thompson had called her aside and told her she wasn't ready. Because somewhere in the disappointment and fear, Sarah had felt something else, a cold, crystalline certainty that he was wrong. The evaluation began at dawn. 43 recruits stood in formation, their faces grim with determination and terror in roughly equal measure. Sarah could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, but her breathing was steady and her hands were calm. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine the rest of her life, but she had never felt more prepared for anything. The 2-mile run came first. Full combat gear, 40-pound packs, weapons, the works. The Georgia heat was already building, promising another day of suffocating humidity that would make every breath feel like drowning. Sarah positioned herself in the middle of the formation, close enough to keep pace with the leaders, but not so close as to draw unnecessary attention. The first mile was deceptively easy. The pace was manageable, and most of the recruits were running comfortably, their breathing controlled and their movements efficient. Sarah felt good, strong, like she could maintain this pace indefinitely. But she knew the real test would come in the second mile, when exhaustion started to set in and the heat began to take its toll. By mile 1.5, the formation had begun to stretch out. The strongest runners were pulling away from the pack, while others began to struggle with the heat and the weight of their equipment. Sarah found herself moving up through the ranks, passing recruits who were already showing signs of distress. Jackson was directly in front of her, his breathing labored and his pace beginning to falter. Rodriguez had fallen back somewhere in the middle of the pack, his slight frame struggling under the weight of equipment that seemed designed for much larger people. Sarah could hear Thompson and the other drill sergeants calling out encouragement and threats in roughly equal measure, their voices carrying across the course like the sound of approaching thunder. With a 1/4 mile to go, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. Instead of sprinting ahead to secure her own position, she slowed down to match Jackson's struggling pace. "Come on," she said quietly, running alongside him. "You've got this." Jackson looked at her with surprise and something that might have been gratitude. "Can't keep up," he gasped. "Yes, you can. Just focus on my pace. Don't think about the finish line. Just think about the next step." For the final 1/4 mile, Sarah Martinez ran at Jackson's pace, sacrificing her own time to help him finish. When they crossed the finish line together, she was barely winded while he collapsed to his knees, but they had both completed the run within the required time. Thompson watched this exchange with an expression that Sarah couldn't read, but she thought she saw something that might have been approval flicker across his face before the mask of professional indifference slammed back into place. The obstacle course was next, And this was where Sarah truly began to shine. The course was designed to test every aspect of physical capability: upper body strength, agility, problem-solving under pressure, and the ability to function effectively while exhausted and stressed. Sarah moved through the obstacles like water flowing downhill, finding the most efficient path through each challenge and executing every movement with precision that bordered on artistry. When she reached the section that required carrying a wounded soldier, she found herself paired with Davis, the largest recruit in their unit, a former college football player who outweighed her by 60 pounds. "This is impossible," Davis muttered as they approached the carry. "You can't move me that distance." Sarah looked at the course ahead, calculating angles and leverage points. "Get on my back," she said. "What?" "Trust me. Get on my back and hold on." What followed was one of those moments that would be talked about for years afterward. Sarah Martinez, all 5'6" and 130 pounds of her, carried a 190-pound man through a quarter-mile obstacle course in a time that beat 70% of the male teams. She didn't do it through brute strength, but through technique, determination, and a refusal to accept that physics made it impossible. By the time they reached the weapons portion of the evaluation, word had begun to spread among the drill sergeants about the small recruit who was quietly dismantling every assumption they had made about her capabilities. Sarah's marksmanship scores were nearly perfect. Even while exhausted and disoriented from the physical challenges, her weapons handling was crisp and professional, and her tactical decision-making showed a natural understanding of combat principles that couldn't be taught. When the evaluation ended, Sarah Martinez had posted the third highest overall score in her unit. More importantly, she had helped 3 other recruits achieve passing grades who might not have made it without her assistance. That night, Thompson called her aside again. "I owe you an apology, Martinez," he said. Sarah stood at attention, unsure how to respond. "I was wrong about you. Not about your capabilities, those were obvious from day one. I was wrong about your character. A soldier's job isn't just to be strong or fast or tough. A soldier's job is to accomplish the mission and take care of their people. Today, you did both. Thank you, Drill Sergeant." "Don't thank me yet. What you did today was impressive. But basic training is just the beginning. If you really want to test yourself, if you really want to find out what you're capable of, there are opportunities for soldiers like you. Special assignments, elite units, places where being exceptional is just the price of admission." Sarah felt her heart rate spike. "What kind of opportunities?" Thompson smiled, and for the first time since she had met him, it was a genuine expression of warmth rather than professional courtesy. "The kind that have been waiting for someone exactly like you to come along and claim them." That night, Sarah Martinez lay in her bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of 42 other people sleeping, but her mind was racing with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. She had come to basic training hoping to prove she belonged. Instead, she had discovered that belonging was just the beginning. Somewhere out there, beyond the gates of Fort Benning and the familiar world of basic training, were challenges that would make everything she had endured so far look like a warm-up exercise. And for the first time in her life, instead of feeling intimidated by that prospect, Sarah Martinez felt something that was almost like hunger. She was ready to find out what came next. The remaining weeks of basic training passed in a blur of incremental improvements and growing confidence. Sarah had found her rhythm, and more importantly, she had found her place within the unit. The other recruits no longer saw her as an outsider or a liability. She had become the person they came to when they needed help with physical challenges, tactical problems, or just someone to remind them why they were there in the first place. Graduation day arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made even Georgia feel pleasant. Sarah stood in formation with her fellow soldiers, no longer recruits, wearing the same uniform and carrying the same pride, but knowing that her journey was just beginning, while many of theirs were effectively complete. Her family had made the long drive from Texas to watch the ceremony. Sarah could see them in the crowd, her mother crying with pride, her father standing straighter than she had ever seen him, Roberto and Maria looking at their sister like she had just accomplished something impossible. Because she had. Sarah Martinez had taken the first step on a path that would lead her places she couldn't yet imagine. She had proven to herself and everyone else that she belonged here. But more than that, she had discovered that belonging was just the foundation for something much bigger. As she marched across the stage to receive her certificate, Sarah could hear Thompson's voice in her head talking about opportunities for exceptional soldiers. She thought about the challenges that were waiting for her, the tests she hadn't even heard of yet, the records that existed to be broken. And for the first time in her life, Sarah Martinez smiled, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. The question wasn't whether she was ready for what came next. The question was whether what came next was ready for her. Fort Bragg was a different world entirely. Where basic training had been about breaking down civilians and rebuilding them as soldiers, advanced individual training was about separating the soldiers from the warriors. Sarah arrived on a cold February morning, her breath visible in the crisp North Carolina air, carrying orders that still felt surreal even after reading them a dozen times. She had been selected for military police training, but not the standard variety. Her exceptional performance at Fort Benning had earned her a slot in the Elite Security Forces program, a specialized unit responsible for protecting high-value targets and conducting sensitive operations that required the highest levels of physical and mental conditioning. Out of the 8,000 soldiers who had applied for the program that year, only 47 had been selected. Sarah was the only woman. The realization hit her as she stood in formation with her new unit for the first time. 46 men and her, all of them hand-picked from the top performers across the entire army. These weren't the farm kids and city boys she had trained with at basic. These were soldiers who had already proven themselves exceptional, and now they were here to prove they could be something beyond exceptional. Staff Sergeant Cole ran the program with the kind of quiet intensity that made Drill Sergeant Thompson look like a kindergarten teacher. He was a compact man with graying temples and eyes that seemed to catalogue every weakness and strength of the soldiers under his command. When he looked at Sarah, she felt like he was reading a manual written in a language only he understood. "This program has a 92% failure rate," he announced to the formation on their first morning. "Most of you will not be here in 3 months. The ones who remain will be capable of things you currently believe are impossible. The question isn't whether you're good enough to be here now. The question is whether you're willing to become someone you don't recognize in order to stay."
The training was unlike anything Sarah had experienced.
Where basic training had been about learning to follow orders and work as part of a team, security forces training was about learning to think independently under impossible pressure while maintaining the discipline and precision that kept people alive. They learned advanced weapon systems, tactical planning, close-quarters combat, and psychological operations. They were taught to think like criminals in order to stop them, to anticipate threats that hadn't been identified yet, and to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between a successful mission and a catastrophic failure. But the physical training was what truly separated this program from everything else. The soldiers weren't just expected to be in good shape, they were expected to be machines, capable of performing at peak efficiency under any conditions imaginable. The obstacle course at Fort Bragg was legendary, known simply as the Beast. It was a mile-long nightmare of challenges that had been refined over decades to test every aspect of physical and mental capability. Rope climbs, wall scaling, underground crawls, water obstacles, and precision tasks that required steady hands even while exhausted and disoriented. The current record holder was Sergeant Major Williams, a career soldier who had set the mark 8 years earlier during his own security forces training. His time of 14 minutes and 37 seconds was considered untouchable, a perfect storm of natural ability, ideal conditions, and pure determination that couldn't be replicated. Sarah first attempted the Beast during her 3rd week of training. She posted a respectable time of 18 minutes and 43 seconds, good enough to place her in the top 10 of all current trainees, and better than most soldiers managed after months of practice. But respectable wasn't what she was after. "Not bad for a first attempt," Staff Sergeant Cole told her afterward, as she stood dripping with sweat and muddy water. "With more training, you could probably get that down to 17 minutes. Sarah nodded, but something in her expression made Cole study her more carefully. "What are you thinking, Martinez?"
"I'm thinking about William's record," she said quietly.
Cole's eyebrows raised. That's not a realistic goal for anyone, let alone someone who's been here 3 weeks.
Why not?
It was a simple question, but it hung in the air between them like a challenge. Cole had seen hundreds of exceptional soldiers come through this program. He had watched men who could bench press twice their body weight fail to complete the Beast in under 20 minutes. He had seen Olympic-level athletes break down crying at the water obstacles. Williams' record wasn't just fast, it was inhuman. Because it is what it is, Cole said finally. Some records are meant to be admired, not broken. But Sarah had heard variations of that same sentiment her entire life. Some things were meant for some people and not others. Some dreams were realistic and some weren't. Some records were breakable and some weren't. The problem was that Sarah Martinez had never learned to accept the difference. Over the next month, she began studying the Beast with the intensity of a doctoral student researching a dissertation. She timed herself on individual sections, analyzed the most efficient paths through each obstacle, and practiced specific techniques until they became as automatic as breathing. Her fellow trainees began to notice her obsession. During their limited free time, when most soldiers were resting or writing letters home, Sarah could be found at the Beast, working through sections of the course over and over again. "You know you're crazy, right?" Private First Class Harrison told her one evening as she practiced rope climbs for the 100th time. Harrison was a former Navy SEAL who had transferred to the Army for reasons he never discussed, and his opinion carried weight among the trainees. "Probably," Sarah agreed, not pausing in her climb. "Williams' record isn't just about speed. It's about perfect conditions, perfect weather, perfect timing. You'd need everything to go exactly right. Then I'll keep trying until everything goes exactly right." Harrison studied her for a moment, recognizing something in her determination that reminded him of himself at a much younger age. "You know what you're really attempting here, don't you? You're not just trying to break a record. You're trying to prove that exceptional isn't good enough for Sarah Martinez." He was right, and Sarah knew it. But she also knew that she had spent her entire life being told that she should be grateful for good enough, satisfied with respectable, content with exceptional, and she was tired of settling for anything less than everything she was capable of achieving. The opportunity came on a Tuesday in April. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with no wind and clear skies. Sarah had been tracking conditions for weeks, waiting for a day when everything aligned properly. She had requested permission to attempt an official record run, and Cole had granted it more out of curiosity than any real belief she could succeed. Word had spread throughout the base that Martinez was going to attempt Williams' record. A small crowd had gathered at the starting line, including several instructors and even Colonel Peterson, the base commander, who had driven over to watch what many expected to be an expensive lesson in knowing one's limitations. Sarah stood at the starting line, looking down the length of the Beast, and felt a strange calm settle over her. She had run this course hundreds of times in pieces, thousands of times in her mind. Every obstacle was familiar, every efficient path had been memorized, every potential problem had been anticipated and planned for. "You sure about this, Martinez?" Cole asked quietly. "Yes, Staff Sergeant. Remember, this isn't just about you anymore. Every woman who comes after you will be measured against whatever you accomplish today."
It was meant to be encouraging, but Sarah felt the weight of representation settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket.
She wasn't just Sarah Martinez attempting an impossible record. She was a woman attempting to do something no woman had ever done, in a place where women weren't supposed to be, in front of people who were waiting to see her fail so they could confirm what they had always believed about women in combat roles. But as she stood there, feeling the eyes of dozens of soldiers watching her, Sarah realized that the pressure wasn't crushing her. It was clarifying her. All the noise, all the doubt, all the expectations, they all fell away until there was nothing left but Sarah Martinez and 14 minutes and 37 seconds of impossibility stretching out in front of her. The whistle blew. Sarah exploded from the starting line with a speed that surprised even her. The first obstacle was a rope climb, 30 feet straight up with no assistance except grip strength and technique. She attacked it with the fluid grace of someone who had practiced the movement until it became instinctual, her body flowing up the rope like she was defying gravity rather than fighting it. The crowd fell silent as they watched her clear the first 3 obstacles in times that were already approaching record pace. But the Beast was designed to break down even exceptional soldiers, and the early obstacles were just the warm-up. The 4th obstacle was a wall-scaling challenge, 12 feet of smooth concrete that required a running start and perfect timing to clear. Sarah hit it at full speed, her momentum carrying her up and over with an efficiency that made it look effortless. Behind her, she could hear someone in the crowd say something that sounded like profanity, mixed with amazement. The middle section of the course was where most attempts fell apart. A series of precision challenges that required soldiers to maintain fine motor control while exhausted, disoriented, and racing against time. Threading ropes through small openings, assembling weapons with muddy hands, navigating balance beams while carrying awkward loads. Sarah moved through this section like she was following a choreographed routine. Every movement was economical, purposeful, designed to accomplish the objective with minimum energy expenditure and maximum speed. She could feel her heart pounding and her lungs burning, but her hands remained steady and her focus absolute. The water obstacles came next, a series of pools, streams, and flooded trenches that had to be crossed without the benefit of bridges or boats. This was where technique mattered more than raw strength, where understanding, leverage, and momentum could save precious seconds that meant the difference between success and failure. Sarah hit the water moving faster than anyone had ever seen, using techniques she had developed through months of practice to maintain speed while navigating obstacles that typically forced soldiers to slow down and proceed carefully. She was soaked, muddy, and exhausted, but she was also ahead of pace and still accelerating. The final section of the beast was pure endurance. A quarter-mile sprint through a maze of barriers, crawls, and climbs that had to be completed while carrying a 40-pound pack and a weapon. This was where exceptional soldiers discovered they were merely human, where perfect technique meant nothing if your body simply couldn't respond to what your mind was demanding. Sarah could hear the crowd now, their voices carrying across the course as they realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. She couldn't make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakable. Excitement, disbelief, and something that sounded like awe. With 100 yards to go, Sarah Martinez was 30 seconds ahead of record pace. But the beast had one final challenge, the cruelest obstacle of all. A 50-foot rope climb straight up while exhausted and carrying full gear. This was where Williams had set his record, finding just enough strength for one final burst of speed that carried him across the finish line in 14 minutes and 37 seconds. Sarah approached the rope, knowing that everything depended on the next 60 seconds. Her arms felt like lead, her legs were shaking with exhaustion, and her lungs were burning with every breath. But she also knew that she would never forgive herself if she settled for second best when first place was hanging from a rope 50 feet above her head. She began to climb. The world narrowed to just Sarah and the rope and the impossible distance between where she was and where she needed to be. Hand over hand, using technique and determination to compensate for strength that was rapidly abandoning her. The crowd below disappeared, the pain in her muscles became irrelevant, and time seemed to slow down until there was nothing but the movement and the goal. 30 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet. Sarah Martinez rang the bell at the top of the rope and began her descent, knowing that she was about to become the first person in 8 years to break Williams' record. But she didn't know yet how much she was about to break it by. She crossed the finish line at 13 minutes and 52 seconds. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah wondered if she had actually collapsed and was experiencing some kind of oxygen-deprived hallucination. 46 of the most elite soldiers in the army stood motionless, staring at a stopwatch that displayed a time that shouldn't have been possible. She hadn't just broken Williams' record, she had obliterated it. 45 seconds was an eternity in a race measured in minutes. It was the difference between exceptional and legendary, between impressive and impossible. Colonel Peterson was the first to speak, his voice carrying across the silent crowd with the authority of someone who had spent 30 years in the military and had never seen anything quite like what he had just witnessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "you have just watched history being made." The crowd erupted. 46 elite soldiers began cheering with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for championship games or homecomings. They rushed towards Sarah, lifting her onto their shoulders and celebrating her achievement like it was their own. But through all the noise and celebration, Sarah could see Staff Sergeant Cole standing apart from the crowd, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. When their eyes met, he nodded once, a gesture of respect and recognition that meant more to her than all the cheering in the world. Later that evening, Cole called her aside for a private conversation. "You know what you've done here, don't you?" he asked. "I broke a record," Sarah said simply. "You did more than that. You changed what people think is possible. Tomorrow, there will be soldiers attempting things they never would have tried before today. Young women will join the army because they heard about what Sarah Martinez accomplished. Records will be broken because you proved they could be broken." Sarah nodded, understanding the weight of what he was telling her. "But more than that," Cole continued, "you've proven something about yourself that can't be taken away. Most people spend their entire lives wondering what they're truly capable of. You found out today. The question now is what you're going to do with that knowledge." It was a good question, and one that Sarah would spend the rest of her career answering. But as she stood there, still covered in mud and sweat from the beast, still trying to process what she had accomplished, Sarah Martinez knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was just getting started. The news of Sarah's record-breaking performance spread through the military community like wildfire. Within 48 hours, her name was being mentioned in Pentagon briefings, discussed in military academies, and featured in articles that would be read by soldiers on bases around the world. The girl from small-town Texas who had asked, "Can I try?" had become a phenomenon that no one quite knew how to handle. But fame in the military came with complications that civilian celebrity never encountered. Sarah Martinez wasn't just a record holder now. She was a symbol, a test case, and a lightning rod for debates about women in combat that had been simmering for decades. Every opinion about gender equality in the armed forces suddenly had a name and a face, and that face belonged to a 20-year-old woman who had never asked to become anyone's poster child. The first sign that her life had fundamentally changed came 3 days after her record run. Colonel Peterson called her into his office, where she found 2 men in dress uniforms waiting with expressions that managed to be both congratulatory and concerned. "Martinez, I'd like you to meet Major General Richardson and Colonel Hayes from Pentagon Personnel Command," Peterson said. "They've driven down from Washington specifically to meet you." Sarah stood at attention, her mind racing through possible reasons why officers of this rank would make a personal trip to discuss her situation. In her experience, when generals became personally interested in individual soldiers, it usually meant either something very good or something very bad was about to happen. "At ease, Sergeant Martinez," General Richardson said. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that made rooms feel smaller just by his being in them. "First, let me say that what you accomplished 3 days ago was extraordinary."
The entire chain of command has taken notice. Thank you, sir.
However, Colonel Hayes interjected, your achievement has created some unique challenges that we need to address. Hayes was younger than Richardson, probably in his early 40s, with the lean build of someone who still maintained the physical standards he had established as a young officer.
But there was something in his tone that made Sarah's stomach tighten with apprehension. "What kind of challenges, sir?" Richardson and Hayes exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes of information Sarah wasn't privy to. "Your record has generated significant media attention," Richardson explained. "Congressional representatives are asking questions about women in special operations. Defense Secretary briefings are including your name. You've become a focal point for policy discussions that are much larger than any individual soldier." Sarah felt a cold weight settling in her chest. She had broken a record because she wanted to test her own limits, not because she wanted to become a political symbol or a case study in military policy. "Sir, I just want to be a soldier," she said quietly. "And that's exactly the problem," Hayes said, his tone sharper than Richardson's diplomatic approach. "You can't just be a soldier anymore, Martinez. Whether you wanted it or not, you're now the face of women in elite military units. Everything you do from now on will be scrutinized, analyzed, and used to support or oppose policy positions that affect thousands of other women." The weight of representation that Sarah had felt before her record attempt now seemed crushing. She thought about all the young women who might join the military because of what she had accomplished, and about all the women already serving who might face increased scrutiny because of the attention her achievement had generated. "There are options," Richardson said, his voice gentler than Hayes's. "We can arrange for a transfer to a position where you can serve with distinction while avoiding the spotlight. Training command, recruiting duty, positions where your expertise would be valuable but where you wouldn't be constantly under public examination." Sarah understood what they were offering. A comfortable, respectable career path that would remove her from the controversy her success had created. She would be respected, well compensated, and free from the burden of representing anyone but herself. "And if I want to stay in special operations?" she asked. Hayes leaned forward in his chair. "Then you need to understand that you'll be operating under a microscope. Every mission, every evaluation, every interaction with fellow soldiers will be documented and analyzed. You'll be held to standards that are higher than anyone else's, and you'll face opposition from people who see your very presence as a threat to military tradition." "Opposition from fellow soldiers?" "Some of it," Richardson admitted. "But also from Congress, from military leadership, from civilian oversight committees. There are people in positions of power who believe that your success was an anomaly, a publicity stunt, or evidence that standards have been lowered to accommodate political correctness." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, hot and immediate. The idea that anyone could look at what she had accomplished and dismiss it as anything other than legitimate achievement was infuriating. But before she could respond, Hayes continued, "There's something else you need to know. There are already whispers about the legitimacy of your record. Questions about timing accuracy, course conditions, whether special accommodations were made. None of it is true, but truth isn't always the determining factor in these situations." The anger turned cold, crystallizing into something harder and more focused. Sarah had spent her entire life fighting against people who wanted to minimize her achievements, who looked for reasons to explain away her success rather than acknowledge her capability. Now she was discovering that breaking the most difficult record in the Army had only intensified that scrutiny. "What are you recommending, sir?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Richardson studied her for a long moment before answering. "Personally, I think you should stay and fight. The military needs soldiers like you, and it needs to prove that merit is the only standard that matters. But I also think you need to understand what you're signing up for. A war on two fronts, Hayes added. External missions and internal politics. Are you prepared for that? Sarah thought about her conversation with Staff Sergeant Cole, about his warning that she had changed what people thought was possible. She thought about her family back in Texas, proud but probably worried about their daughter, who seemed determined to prove herself in increasingly dangerous ways. She thought about every young woman who might see her story and decide that they too belonged in places where they had never been welcome.
I didn't break that record to make a political statement, she said finally.
I broke it because I wanted to see what I was capable of. But if my being here makes it easier for the next woman who wants to test herself, then I guess that's worth fighting for. Richardson smiled for the first time during the conversation. I was hoping you'd say that. What followed was a crash course in military politics that Sarah's training had never covered. She was assigned a media relations handler, briefed on appropriate responses to various types of questions, and given explicit guidance on what topics to avoid in any public statements. But the real education came from her fellow soldiers. The response to her record had divided the military community in ways that weren't immediately obvious, but became clear through 1,000 small interactions. Some soldiers treated her like a celebrity, seeking her out for photos and autographs, asking for training advice, and generally regarding her as proof that the military was evolving in positive directions. Their enthusiasm was gratifying but also overwhelming for someone who had never sought attention. Others treated her with a professional respect that seemed genuine and uncomplicated. They acknowledged her achievement, congratulated her appropriately, and then went back to treating her like any other exceptional soldier. This group, which included Staff Sergeant Cole and most of her immediate colleagues, provided the stability she needed to maintain some sense of normalcy. But there was a third group, smaller but more vocal, that regarded her success with suspicion, resentment, or outright hostility. They didn't usually confront her directly, but Sarah could feel their disapproval in sideways glances, overheard conversations, and the subtle ways that information was sometimes withheld or support was delayed. The most difficult encounter came 3 weeks after the Pentagon visit. Sarah was finishing a training session when Master Sergeant Williams himself approached her. He was the record holder she had displaced, a career soldier with 22 years of service and a reputation for both excellence and integrity. Sergeant Martinez, he said, his tone formal but not unfriendly. I wanted to congratulate you personally on your achievement.
Sarah came to attention.
Thank you, Master Sergeant. I also wanted to say that I hope you understand the responsibility that comes with holding that record. It's not just about personal accomplishment. That record represents the standard that every soldier in this program will be measured against. I understand, Master Sergeant. Williams studied her for a moment, and Sarah sensed that this conversation was about more than congratulations. There are people who want to see you fail, he said quietly, not because they have anything personal against you, but because they see your success as a threat to something they value. They'll look for any excuse to prove that your achievement was somehow illegitimate. I'm prepared for that. Are you? Because it's not just about being scrutinized. They'll create situations designed to make you fail. They'll hold you to impossible standards and then point to any shortcoming as evidence that you don't belong here. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. She had been experiencing exactly what Williams was describing, but hadn't fully understood the systematic nature of it. What do you recommend? She asked. Williams looked around to ensure they weren't being overheard, then stepped closer. Be better than perfect, he said. Not just as good as everyone else. Not just exceptional. Be so undeniably superior that there's no room for doubt. And even then, be prepared for people to find ways to diminish what you accomplish. It was sobering advice from someone who understood exactly what Sarah was facing. Williams had held the record for 8 years, long enough to understand the weight that came with being the standard against which everyone else was measured. Master Sergeant, Sarah said carefully, do you think I deserve to hold your record? Williams smiled, and for the first time in their conversation, his expression was genuinely warm. Martinez, I've been hoping someone would break that record for years. The fact that it was you, breaking it the way you did, makes me prouder of what I accomplished than anything that happened while I held it. The conversation with Williams marked a turning point in Sarah's understanding of her situation. She stopped seeing the scrutiny and resistance as personal attacks and began to recognize them as inevitable consequences of occupying a position that challenged established assumptions about who belonged in elite military units. But recognizing the nature of the challenge didn't make it easier to handle. If anything, it made the pressure more intense. Every training exercise became a test of whether Sarah Martinez was a legitimate member of the elite community or an anomaly who would eventually be exposed as inadequate. The real test came 2 months later, when Sarah was selected for her first operational deployment. It was a relatively low-risk assignment, a security detail for a diplomatic mission to Eastern Europe, but it would be her first chance to prove herself in actual field conditions rather than training scenarios. The night before deployment, Cole called her aside for what had become their traditional pre-mission conversation. "You ready for this?" he asked. "Yes, Staff Sergeant. Remember what I told you about being better than perfect?" Sarah nodded. "This deployment isn't just about completing the mission. It's about proving that everything you've accomplished so far was legitimate. There will be people watching to see if Sarah Martinez can perform under real-world conditions, or if she's just exceptional at taking tests."
I understand.
Cole studied her for a moment, seeing something in her expression that he recognized from his own early career.
Martinez, can I give you some personal advice?
Of course, Staff Sergeant. Stop trying to prove yourself to people who have already decided they don't want to be convinced. Focus on the mission, take care of your team, and let your performance speak for itself.
The people whose opinions actually matter will judge you based on results, not politics. It was good advice, and Sarah carried it with her as she prepared for her first real test as an elite soldier. She had broken the record that everyone said was unbreakable. Now she had to prove that breaking records was just the beginning of what Sarah Martinez was capable of accomplishing. The deployment would either validate everything she had worked for or provide ammunition for those who wanted to see her fail. Either way, Sarah Martinez was ready to find out which it would be. As she packed her equipment and reviewed mission protocols, Sarah thought about the conversation with the Pentagon officials, about their warning that she would be fighting a war on two fronts. They had been right about that, but they had missed something important. Sarah Martinez had been fighting on multiple fronts her entire life. The only difference now was that the stakes were higher and the audience was bigger. But the fundamental challenge remained the same, proving that she belonged exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was doing, regardless of what anyone else thought was possible. And if her record at Fort Bragg had proven anything, it was that Sarah Martinez was very good at proving people wrong about what was possible. The mission in Eastern Europe lasted 6 months and changed everything. Not because anything dramatic happened, Sarah would later reflect, but because nothing dramatic happened. She performed her duties with the same quiet competence she had always demonstrated, protected the people she was assigned to protect, and completed every objective without incident or fanfare. In a profession where success was often measured by the absence of problems rather than the presence of excitement, Sarah Martinez had proven herself in the most definitive way possible. She had been utterly, completely normal. But normal, for Sarah Martinez, was extraordinary by everyone else's standards. Her performance reports from the deployment read like a textbook case study in professional excellence. Punctual, reliable, tactically sound, physically capable, and demonstrating the kind of judgment under pressure that marked the difference between good soldiers and exceptional ones. Her commanding officer, Major Thompson, wrote in his final evaluation that Sergeant Martinez was the most naturally gifted security specialist I have encountered in 15 years of field operations. More importantly, her teammates had begun to treat her not as a curiosity or a symbol, but simply as Martinez, the soldier you wanted watching your back when things got complicated. The real validation came from Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, a 10-year veteran who had initially been skeptical of having a woman on the team. 3 weeks into the deployment, after Sarah had spent an entire night maintaining watch in freezing rain without complaint, Rodriguez had pulled her aside. "Martinez," he had said, "I owe you an apology." "For what, Sergeant?" "For thinking that your record was some kind of fluke. For wondering if you'd be able to pull your weight in real conditions. You're not just good at this job, you're better at it than most people who've been doing it for years." It was the kind of acceptance that couldn't be manufactured or awarded, only earned through the daily accumulation of competence and reliability. Sarah had finally achieved what she had been seeking since the day she first asked, "Can I try?" She belonged here not because anyone had made special allowances for her, but because she had proven herself indispensable. The homecoming was a whirlwind of debriefings, performance evaluations, and media attention that Sarah had learned to navigate with professional grace. Her success in the field had silenced many of her critics and generated new opportunities that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. Colonel Peterson called her into his office on her second day back, but this time the conversation was about possibilities rather than problems. "Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you. Your performance over the past year has been exceptional by any standard. The Pentagon wants to discuss your future, and there are options available that weren't on the table when we first met." Sarah sat forward, intrigued, but cautious. Her experience had taught her that opportunities in the military often came with complications that weren't immediately apparent. "What kind of options, sir?" Special Operations Command has expressed interest in your capabilities. There are units within SOCOM that could use someone with your particular combination of skills and experience. Sarah felt her heart rate spike. Special Operations Command represented the absolute pinnacle of military service, the elite of the elite, where only the most exceptional soldiers earned the privilege of serving. There's also interest from the training community, Peterson continued. Your record has inspired changes in how we approach physical fitness standards and obstacle course design. There's a position available developing new training protocols that could impact how we prepare soldiers for years to come. It was the crossroads Sarah had always known would eventually arrive. The choice between continuing to push her own limits in operational roles or transitioning to positions where she could influence how the military approached the development of future soldiers. Sir, can I ask what you would recommend? Peterson leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of attention he typically reserved for complex tactical problems. Personally, I think you should follow whatever path allows you to have the greatest impact. You've already proven that the impossible is achievable. The question now is whether you want to keep proving it yourself or start teaching other people how to prove it. That evening, Sarah called her family for the first time since returning from deployment. The conversation was awkward at first, as it always was when she tried to explain her military life to people whose understanding of her world came from movies and news reports. Mija, her mother said. We saw you on the television news. They said you were a hero. Sarah winced. The media coverage of her deployment had focused more on the symbolism of her success than the practical details of her service, turning her into a poster child for women in the military rather than simply a soldier who had done her job well. I'm not a hero, Mama. I'm just a soldier who did what soldiers do. But they said you broke some kind of record that no woman had ever broken before. That's true. And now they want you to do even more dangerous things? Sarah could hear the worry in her mother's voice, the same concern that had been there since the day she announced her intention to join the army. But there was something else now, too. Pride, maybe, or at least acceptance that her daughter had chosen a path that was working out better than anyone had dared to hope. They want to give me opportunities, Mama. Chances to do things that matter. Her father's voice came on the line, gruff with emotion. We're proud of you, Sarah. Your whole town is proud of you. Mrs. Patterson shows everyone the newspaper articles about you. The irony of her former guidance counselor, now bragging about the student she had tried to steer toward more realistic career goals, wasn't lost on Sarah. But she found herself more amused than bitter about it. Mrs. Patterson had been wrong about what was possible, but she had been operating with the best information available to her at the time. Papa, can I ask you something? Of course. When I was growing up, did you ever think I would end up doing something like this? There was a long pause before he answered. No, Mija. I thought you would find a good job, maybe get married, have a family. I worried that you wanted things that might hurt you. Do you still worry about that? Another pause. Longer this time. I worry about you being safe, he said finally. But I stopped worrying about you wanting too much. Now I worry that the world isn't big enough for everything you might accomplish. 2 days later, Sarah was on a plane to Washington, D.C. for meetings that would determine the next phase of her career. The Pentagon was a maze of corridors and offices that seemed designed to intimidate visitors, but Sarah had learned to navigate institutional power structures with the same tactical awareness she applied to military operations. The meeting was with General Harrison, a 3-star officer who oversaw special operations recruitment and training. He was older than the other senior officers Sarah had met, probably in his late 50s. With grey hair and the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of making decisions that affected people's lives. Sergeant Martinez, he said when she entered his office, your reputation precedes you. Thank you, sir. I've been following your career with interest, your record at Fort Bragg, your performance in training, your deployment evaluation. All exceptional. But I'm not here to discuss what you've already accomplished. Sarah waited, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere significant. I'm here to discuss what you could accomplish if you had the right platform. Special Operations Command is developing new training protocols, new standards, new approaches to preparing soldiers for missions that require the highest levels of capability. We need someone who understands what it takes to push beyond established limits. What kind of position are you describing, sir? Training development and implementation. You would be responsible for designing courses, establishing standards, and personally training soldiers who are being prepared for the most demanding operations in the military. It was an extraordinary opportunity, the kind of position that could influence military training for generations. But it was also a step away from operational roles, a move toward institutional influence rather than personal achievement. Sir, can I ask why you're offering this to me specifically?
General Harrison smiled.
Because you've proven that impossible is just another word for hasn't been done yet. We need that perspective in our training programs. We need someone who can look at established limits and figure out how to exceed them. And if I prefer to stay in operational roles? Then you'll continue to serve with distinction, and we'll find someone else to revolutionize how we train soldiers. But Martinez? He leaned forward, his expression serious. You have the opportunity to impact thousands of military careers, to ensure that the next generation of soldiers is prepared for challenges we can't even imagine yet. That's a bigger legacy than any individual record or mission. Sarah left the Pentagon with a decision to make, and 2 weeks to make it. She spent those weeks talking to mentors, reviewing her options, and trying to understand what kind of impact she wanted to have on the world. The answer came during a conversation with Staff Sergeant Cole, who had been promoted and transferred to Fort Campbell, but remained someone Sarah trusted for honest advice. What's the most important thing you've learnt in your military career? He asked during their phone conversation. Sarah thought about it for a moment. That most limitations are imaginary. That the difference between impossible and possible is usually just someone willing to try. And how many people do you think need to learn that lesson? Everyone! Then you have your answer. Sarah called General Harrison the next morning and accepted the position. 6 months later, she was leading the development of training programs that would prepare soldiers for challenges that previous generations had never faced. Her protocols were implemented at bases across the country, and her influence extended far beyond the specific soldiers she worked with directly. But the most important moment came 2 years later, when Sarah was observing a group of new recruits attempting an obstacle course she had designed. The course was challenging but fair, demanding but achievable, designed to push soldiers beyond what they thought they could accomplish, while giving them the tools they needed to succeed. One of the recruits was struggling, a young woman from rural Montana who was clearly intimidated by the physical demands of the course. Sarah watched as the recruit approached the rope climb that had been modified based on techniques Sarah had developed during her own training. "Can I try again, ma'am?" the recruit asked after failing her first attempt. Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that transcended the specific moment. This was why she had chosen the training path rather than continuing in operational roles, not for the individual achievements she might have accumulated, but for the opportunity to create systems that would help other people discover what they were capable of accomplishing. "Yes," Sarah said, her voice carrying echoes of every conversation that had brought her to this moment. "You can always try again." The recruit completed the rope climb on her second attempt, and Sarah watched her realize that she was capable of more than she had believed possible. It was a small moment in one person's military career, but it was also the reason Sarah Martinez had chosen to dedicate her life to serving something larger than her own ambitions. 5 years later, Sarah was a master sergeant responsible for training programs that were being studied and replicated by Allied military forces around the world. Her original record at Fort Bragg had long since been broken by soldiers who had trained using methods she had developed. The young woman from Montana had gone on to qualify for special operations and was serving with distinction in one of the most elite units in the military. Sarah's story had become part of military folklore, told to new recruits, as an example of what was possible when determination met opportunity. But she rarely thought about her own record anymore. Instead, she focused on the hundreds of soldiers who had exceeded their own limitations, using training protocols she had helped create. The most satisfying moments came when former students contacted her to share their own achievements. Soldiers who had been told they weren't strong enough, fast enough, or capable enough, who had gone on to accomplish things that redefined what their instructors thought was possible. Sarah Martinez had asked, "Can I try?" and changed everything. Not just for herself, but for everyone who came after her. She had proven that the most dangerous words in any language weren't spoken by people others expected to succeed, but by people others had already decided to underestimate. And in proving that impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet, Sarah Martinez had created a legacy that would outlast any individual record or achievement. She had taught an entire generation of soldiers that the only real limitations were the ones they imposed on themselves. The girl from small-town Texas who had once been told to lower her expectations before life did it for her, had instead raised the expectations of everyone around her. She had transformed from someone fighting to prove she belonged to someone helping others discover that they belonged anywhere they were brave enough to put themselves. And that transformation, more than any record or achievement, was Sarah Martinez's greatest victory. She had learned that the most important question wasn't whether she could accomplish the impossible, but whether she could teach others to accomplish their own impossibilities. The answer, as it turned out, was yes. She always could.